So I want to introduce some new ideas that have been really kind of help us think about this issue. So one is Michael Linden's work in what is called post-traumatic embitterment disorder. And basically, if we think about despair being cut up into pieces, you can also think about post-traumatic stress being cut up into pieces. And one of the things that comes out of post-traumatic embitterment is a deep feeling of anger and rage. And it is triggered by an event or a series of events that are anxiety provoking. So like Yoda said, fear leads to anger, and life-threatening stimulus that an exceptional, though normal, negative life event occurred. So the fact of the matter is, embitterment, Nietzsche said, nothing consumes man more quickly than the emotion of resentment. I think we have lots of resentment out there. And we have whole stories. You remember the Grinch, and all the characters that we know. Post-traumatic embitterment is, they developed a scale for this and a way of measuring it, and a diagnostic proposal. And you can take things like Charles Dickens' Scrooge, and he is classically embittered. But also, if you look at what's going on in our life, this is a picture of Sandy Hook Elementary School and Adam Lindsay. Kids who are embittered. Whole cultures can become embittered. So, for example, East Berlin, when the country was reunited, East Berliners were very embittered because the good jobs, even though you were a full professor, or you were an experienced bureaucrat, or you had all these skills, you're driving a taxi. The West Berliners were the ones who got the good jobs. And the resentment is huge. Now, if you look at Black Lives Matters and the things that are going on in our culture right now, it's a lot of embitterment. For me, I found for myself, I read the criteria for embitterment and I went, holy cow, that fits for me. And the things that I was mad about everything. And it was a real relief to work on that and to release the things that I was angry about. But part of it was just the struggle. It is to get medicine. I mean, you have all this data out there that has been hard work, and you have, when you do an interview, it appears before you is a physician, white coat, and all you really know is he's got a white coat and he's got a stethoscope, and he says there is no such thing as sex addiction. And there's no chance to ask him, have you ever read any of Reddish's work? Have you looked at the 94 meta-review, or the 94 pages of listing articles that document all of this? And they never look at it. I have a book called Clinical Management of Sex Addiction. We have 2 whole chapters responding to all the criticisms. They aren't interested in responding. A thing came out this week. One of the members of the DSM committee said, if we let all these addictions be addictions, we'd have to pay for them and they'd break the bank. The medical system couldn't sustain it. What happens if we don't? The cost to the culture is huge. Your medical expenses are skyrocketing because we're not dealing with it. So it's like there is a myopia culturally, and we can start dealing with this by looking at the underlying feelings and what Stephen Diamond has called an epidemic of pathological anger, rage, and embitterment, both here in this country and elsewhere. And he talks about anger and rage festers over time, turns into resentment, turns into embitterment, which turns into hatred. And I think that's where we are. Now, one of the interesting things that Lyndon did, and I listed it there for you, 9 dimensions, he uses this, it's from the University of Heidelberg. They looked at what were the commonalities of people who were considered wise. Did they have commonalities? And they came up with the 9 pillars of wisdom. We have since taken that, and we have taken all the things that people have written about that work to help with those kinds of, how to have a wise mind, evaluate, and help with your self-regulation. And what Lyndon found out is that you could teach these. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is in the case of embitterment and in the case of grief, and the case, all these things, we can teach resilience. We can teach people about how to manage it. I want to use that, and this is an example of score changes in terms of controlled studies showing how people could grow from learning about some of the strategies used in a wise mind. So the other thing that I think is another example of PTSD, and I was really struck by Alan Shore. He was introduced at a conference, and he says, all the things I believed most of my life about attachment, I've had to revise in the last 3 years. I feel the same way. I feel like there's things happening underneath us all the time that we need to start looking at. And the tremendous role that grief plays in all of this. And the American Psychological Association, the Monitor, had an article about prolonged grief. And in the ICD-11, there were 4 different instruments offered, and I put that in front of you, of prolonged grief being grief that lasts for a long period of time, as opposed to working through the feelings and coming to some kind of resolution. One of the things that's really interesting in the one on the far left, the ICD-11 one, the current one they're using, one of the issues is that goes with grief is embitterment. And so the fact of the matter is, as we start to parse out and get more precise about it, prolonged grief is like where you hold a resentment for a long time, like the Grinch, like Scrooge, or like the marriage that breaks up, and 10 years later, one partner has gone, done their therapy, done their work, what have you, started a new life, and is fine, is doing okay. The other person's telling the story of the divorce as if it was yesterday. That is prolonged grief. Still holding on. Grief comes from the word grip in Middle French, and it's holding on to things. In the book Recovery Zone, I tried to tackle this issue. And one of the things that has been most successful for me is using the work of Csikszentmihalyi, and the book Flow, and getting into a zone where you are at your best. And Dan Goleman has contributed his book on focus. I mean, he's famous for his book on emotional regulation, but full focus gives us a potential doorway into flow. This is a very important book in which he talks how the brain can be altered intentionally to rebuild. All the brain cells in your brain are replaced in 2 years, and you can literally make a huge difference over the long haul. One of the things with trauma is you can teach, and this is an example of an exercise we use. You can find it in the new edition of Betrayal Bond, which is on traumatic bonding, which just came out. And in there, what we put is this whole thing about a window of tolerance, where you can start looking at what are the triggers that get me into being flooded by my feelings, and what are the ways that I can work on it. In other words, we're teaching wisdom about how we do that. In Recovery Zone, we talk about the grievance story. Every addiction is powered by a grievance story, and you have to take it apart before you can figure out your window of tolerance. You need to dismantle the grievance story and figure out what it is that triggers you. And so that is, of all the exercises in Recovery Zone, when I use that book, it's one of the most powerful things that patients do, is they get and figure out where their grievance story is. And the grievance story draws both on embitterment and grief, because you have both anger and sorrow as part of it. One of the things that we did in looking at sex addicts having the MMPI is we started to look at it from the lens of, as opposed to looking at sex addicts and then what kind of psychopathology exists, we started looking at psychopathology and see what it does to sex addicts. And we created different classes, and one of the things that we learned, for example, is that post-traumatic stress disorder was the largest class that we had, and that they were dealing with it. Almost everybody was. There was a group of that were almost, they had the dark triad, antisocial, narcissism, what have you. And out of the 40 subjects in this particular document, 39 of them were CEOs of major American companies, which brings up the whole Me Too phenomenon and the abuse of sexual abuse within a company. Not all sex addicts belong in the Me Too. Offending behaviors are different than addictive behaviors. But it was an interesting thing for me to see the role that trauma played. So one of the things we have to do then is we have to look at different dimensions of how we do therapy. And Dan Siegel, who is famous for his work in trauma, talked about 9 of them. And the first one he talked about, in order to change, the first is you have to change the mechanisms of attention. That is getting so that the patient has regular practices by which they are aware of what's going on with themselves and what's going on around them. So meditation, bookending, beginning of day, end of day, all the things that we teach in treatment. The second thing is that talks about vertical integration. The top-down brain with the brain around the heart is basically working through the feelings that you have. You have to go down and understand what is the automatic responses that you have all about, and you can change those. And bilateral integration technologies like EMDR, where you're getting one part of the brain talking to other parts of the brain, so they can start connecting the dots between them. Memory that gets lost, stimulating the memory to realize that you got into this situation and the things that got you into trouble by just lining up and seeing what the commonalities are. And the other part of understanding that is that there's a common story, or what we call narrative therapy. You got to change the storyline. In fact, the biggest chance of changing how the brain reclaims itself is it has to be a story. There has to be a story involved, and your story has got to change. That's why the 12-step program has worked so well for so many people. Then there's what we call state integration. It's that part of ourselves that Buddha talked about, is creating an inner observer, a wise mind that looks at how the brain is functioning. And then the other part is what Admiral Stockdale talked about when he was in the concentration camp, is that in order to get out of this is the awareness of what is going on in the here and now, and having a belief and a vision of where you want it to be. So you have to figure that out and to work with it. And then interpersonal integration, this is the mirror neurons. Engaging with people in a new way so that you're showing up for them, putting yourself in their shoes, having the difficult conversations, all the kinds of work we try to do in therapy. But it is also creating empathy. And as we talked about empathy, our compassion scores have declined, as we mentioned. The reality is that's another thing that we got to hit. To do all those things, what Siegel says is, in fact, the whole brain is lifted up to a whole new level of operation. And that's a kind of a way of looking. When we look at our therapy, 50-minute hour doesn't fit that. What you have to start thinking about is a more programmatic response, or more time. so that, and the teaching of patients the kind of skills that they're going to need so that they can, it's going to cause us to change how we practice. And so Never Enough is really basically telling us that if we're going to change, the whole brain's got to participate. And meditation, whatever you're going to use, is important. I inserted in here it's also about where the synecdoches are. What I mean by synecdoches is that synecdoches are when something means more than it should. Let me give you an example. In the song America the Beautiful, America is beautiful. Okay? But when it's sung in a patriotic context, I have had even times when I have been moved to tears by the singing of that song. So it's also about loving my country. Then when my wife was dying and she designed her funeral, the last song in her funeral was America the Beautiful. So when I hear America the Beautiful, I have a different response than other people do because I attach meaning to it. It's different. Same thing happens in sex, for example. It's what the meaning that people give to it. What's the meaning of the bottle of the wine when you open it? What's the rituals associated with it? And danger and risk is very much part of that. And one of the most interesting books about that, Chris Hedges' book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. It's the love of conflict and the excitement of conflict and being in combat. And how, as a war correspondent, all war correspondents talk about how they're addicted to being where the action is. And the reality is that living in that high state of drama is very compelling. And remember, what's released is the enzymes. And when you read the stories of what he talks about in there, you can see why the kind of thing happening in our streets right now becomes compelling. And the final thing I want to mention is that we have an opportunity to make a difference in our culture right now. And what I'm saying to you is addiction is eating our lunch. And what we don't realize is it's also eating up our longevity. Because I think that there not only is the comorbid issues that cause death, there's also I believe, implicit in this, there's a lot of addicts are more suicidal, more hopeless than we ever thought. If you look at all the stuff that I started off with Mark Gold looking on that suggestion, I look at it and I see, like in obesity, I see just the hopelessness. And people eat themselves to death. People overdose to death. And so people are dying. And it's something that we as clinicians need to speak out about, and we need to do something about. But there's a problem. The problem is, if you look at our news, like if you're standing in the grocery store and you're about to check out, there's a whole bunch of things, the Inquirer or what have you. I never buy them, but I like to read them while I'm standing there. I think that, well, if you look at what they talk about treatment centers. All these ads that you are looking at right now come from talking about sex addiction. Why? She went to rehab 5 times. She had the most beautiful voice in the world. She's wealthy beyond God. What's wrong with this woman? And I'll tell you what's wrong. She has handlers. Who, when she comes in, she loves to sing. She loves that feeling of when she performs. And they appeal to that and say, if you don't go on that tour this summer, those psychologists are very nice people, but they don't know business reality. If you don't go on that tour, you'll be a has-been. You'll never get another job, which is not true. And so they put him right back into the toxic stress that was driving the addiction in the first place. There are safe ways to handle that. And so the fact of the matter is there's also embedded in some of these stories that you see on the newsstand and in the media is an anti-therapy, anti-mental health bias, which we have to confront. And a way of thinking about that is thinking about what our purposes were. This painting that's before you comes from the French Revolution. Dr. Pinel is depicted in the painting. He's in a sanitarium. And what he's doing is he's taking the chains off the patients. And what the French Revolution, from his point of view, is about is giving patients the respect that they deserve, that they have a problem that needs some help. They're compassionate doctors. And the next painting that you see comes from England at about the same time. And it's the court, the English court, and the king and queen would go to the sanitarium on Sunday afternoons to look at the inmates and how crazy they are and how weird they are for amusement. And I think what happens is that we're still looking at the people who try to go get help who are famous as literally for amusement. So my suggestion is that, I have an article recently come from Industrial Psychiatry talking about media and mental health, and basically say we're part of the problem because media is changing everything and we're not in it, and we're not making a case for things being treatable. And there's sort of different ways that we are depicted. This next clip, taken from a movie, something about Carol, you'll see how what happens. The patient is sitting there, and the doctor is behind the patient. He goes out for lunch while the guy is still talking, and then comes back in. Just watch this.
A couple of days later, and her father got transferred to Florida in July. So I worked all summer to pay off those debts, and I never saw Mary again. That was, what, 13 years ago.
No, that's very interesting.
Anyway, I know it's not the type of thing you'd forget, but I guess I kind of, I must have blocked it out of my head or something, because I was driving down the highway last week, and I started thinking about Mary, and all of a sudden it was like I couldn't breathe. I mean, I felt like I was gonna die. So I pulled off the road, and I just sort of stopped in this, I guess it was a rest area. I was just kind of shaking, and...
You know, rest areas are homosexual hangouts. Highway rest areas. They're the bathhouses of the 90s for many, 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 many gay men.
So, what are you saying?
Time she's up. We'll delve into that next week.
Now, what I think, after you see that, I mean, it was like, it depicts that mental health is a waste of time, that doctors don't know what they're doing, clinicians don't know what they're doing. What we need is a level of realness. And I picked a piece that I think I've always been struck by the when there are differences, and it's from the Lord of the Rings, and there were differences between the elves and the humans and the dwarves, and they were confronting this major catastrophe. And this elven princess falls in love, as you remember the story, with the prince of the dwarves, and it's like more than just different colors, it's whole species, and they loved each other. And she was forbidden to see him. Anyway, it's the final scene from Lord of the Rings where he's now dead. He got killed in the battle that turned the world around. And she is holding him, and watch this scene.
They want to bury him.
Yes.
If this is love, I do not want it. Take it from me. Please. Why does it hurt so much?
Because it was real.
So I think what happens here is that sorrow, real sorrow, is experienced, and that we as practitioners we need to be as versatile in our own emotional regulation, in our own development as human beings. The best predictor of success is, in fact, that the patient believes you would do what you're recommending. Now, I know every one of us has had the thought sometimes we tell somebody that something they should do, and we realize, if I did it for myself, I'd be better. We all have that. But the point is that the predictor of success is that we are transparent enough and show up in ways that are real. And that's what this was about. It was a real relationship. And I believe if we start making changes and start standing up for looking at the addictions and this huge epidemic that we have, I mean, I think that the deaths per year and the costs per year far outdistance what's happening with COVID. And we can change it. And this next clip kind of illustrates what I think that might mean. That's what I think needs to happen. I think we need to work together collectively to confront the addictions and to integrate psychiatry, medicine, family therapy, trauma therapy, neuroscience, all these things. We need the dialogue because we need to help our country get back to the point where they can have compassion and not be at the mercy of a medical condition that they don't understand. I'd like to thank some people for helping me. Gentle Path at the Meadows has been great to me. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that we have every Meadows patient has access to a brain lab. We teach about the brain. The University of Alberta helped me, and we are working together on genetic studies. And I'd like to also acknowledge the Alberta Family and Wellness people. They have a new course in the brain. It's free, 30 hours. You get certified, and it's because they believe that clinicians really first need to understand the brain. And then the next series is about how addiction is part of that. So if you want to get involved with that, just simply go to Alberta Family Wellness and you'll be directed to how to get involved with that course. Finally, ITAP, which teaches and certifies people in both all the addictions, and so you can be a CSAT, you can be a multiple addiction therapist, and all of these working together make a difference. Now, I've done something unique here. When the people at PESI I was afraid something would happen. So they give you an exam at the end. And so if you need to know what the answers were to the answers on the test, I have them listed. And it was of real value when we had the fallout. But we're going to let those show for a couple minutes apiece, just review and read through it. And then if you need to remember anything. And so they'll be here for about 2 minutes apiece, and you'll have a summary of everything I taught. I thank you for your time. I know this was an investment and appreciate it in this environment that you were willing to take it to be with me.